We actually had seen a little bit of your work about your research on race, and we just wanted to talk about that for a minute because it's not necessarily something we get to talk about on Boom a lot. So before maybe talking about some of the findings of that project, we just wanted to talk about what the implications are for looking at differences between races, or even like this kind of expands to like looking at sensitive populations. How do you deal with those implications and think about them?
No, it's a great question, and I went into the first project. So I did one project quite a number of years ago, back when I was still at Duke, and that was born out of a project that already existed and some data that already existed, and then took a good number of years off from kind of doing that work, mainly because I felt like I needed to learn a little bit more before I jumped back into that space. And so I had the pleasure here and the honor of working with one of our senior sociology professors who really did help to me to begin to understand how to conceptualize some of this, and it was a great experience. Dr. Hill, who's now at she's at MUSC at the moment, but she will eventually transition to a faculty. She's a postdoc now down there. Was the one that brought this back into my space as a doctoral student, as it was a passion that she had, and we had long conversations. And I said, we need to get people with an expertise in this space to help us with defining what we're going to look at and how we're going to identify different things. And he was Dr. Warney Reed is the sociologist. He was fantastic in helping me understand how to really assess race and being very careful about describing it as a social construct and understanding that it was at times a proxy for other things, and how we needed to really walk that path as we were going through that research. And we had some fantastic debates in her committee meetings. I felt horrible for her because they weren't about her project. They were really about how are we going to define race. And when you put a group of people together that span, we had an anthropologist, a sociologist, 3 engineers, and an exercise physiologist on her committee. And so
talk about team.
we had to bring them all in. But we had some really interesting conversations because there was a lot of kind of the basic science side and the engineering side that wanted to define race with a test.
It's very like systematically,
right?
I'm sure.
Yeah. Like they wanted
vectors and
they wanted some sort of test to go like yes or no, and it was fantastic having the anthropologist, Dr. Schmidt from down at Duke, and then Dr. Reed in that conversation to really get everybody to understand that it's not simple, it's not easy. So we've decided to let it be a self-identified measure, and we allow the participants to identify the racial category or categories to which they believe that they fit. And so try in every paper that we write to reiterate that it's that it is a social construct, that it has more to do with community than it does with biology necessarily, and then understanding the limitations when we're trying to write those, that often what we're measuring by looking at race is not biologic. It is something else. And again, we're at the beginning of this, at least for me, of how do we really look at this, but trying to understand it from the standpoint of what has been historically reported as racial health disparities, and beginning to understand how do we as biomechanists begin to walk into that space and say, is it really that, or is there something else? And so again, not believing that we have all the answers to this, but just wanted to start to ask some of those questions to be able to dig a little bit deeper and to understand that it is important, if nothing else, to recognize that there are differences. Some of those are based on the social construct that we're going to use or call race, but I don't think it's clear. I don't think it's an easy one, and it is challenging even in review when we get reviews back, so.
I'm sure.
Because there are all these underlying, like you're saying, health disparities and other things that can be underlying these differences, and things that we might not be capturing or know
can't,
that we
yeah.
need to be measuring. But like you're saying, the fact that there are differences, and I really liked the conclusions of your paper, which all really emphasize the fact that we need to have more diverse, racially and ethnically diverse samples in biomechanics, because you are seeing these differences, and even if they are due to some underlying factors, it still is showing that the samples that we're getting, they're too small to be able to detect these differences, first of all, and then typically they aren't very diverse. So I think those points come across really strong in those papers, and I think set up, I guess, for future work really well, and the importance for that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and thank you. I think of this as where we were a few decades ago with the early sex-based differences work that we all began to do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that took a little time for everybody to sort of figure out how, and that's much clearer in most cases. Although now, I know personally in the lab here, we've asked a lot, like how do we begin to really look even at sex, and are we looking at sex, or are we looking at gender, and how are we really quantifying that, and what does that mean? And so I've had long conversations about, well, what are we really asking people when we put them into a group? Is it phenotypic, right? Is it what we're seeing, or is it a question to them about, what was the sex assigned at birth, or how are they identifying, right? And those are different things, and therefore potentially could have an impact on the results that we get. And so trying to be very thoughtful about how we ask those questions in a way that I know I was not when I started my career. So I try and think of those on a continuum of, there's always a space we're trying to push into that we may not have all the answers for, but it's important to begin to ask the questions so that we know what else we need to do, and who else we need to bring in to partner with us to begin to understand those. And so, again, had the pleasure of working with those two gentlemen, and then the project I mentioned briefly from the graduate student that just finished had a different group of people that came in to help with that one, and one was out of our vet school, actually, but that's where public health sits for us, and so she's an expert in public health, and so brought her in, and then another faculty who does engineering education work, really to understand the engagement piece, because that was something that came out of the projects with Dr. Hill. Was, we struggled to get people for the African American cohort, and understanding what that was about and why, and so that's where Julia Brisbane's project came next. Was, okay, what are some of those factors that are keeping people from being willing to engage in research? And I guess I was very surprised, and that work will come out here, I hope soon, but I was very surprised that still in younger African Americans there is a hesitancy to be involved in research. I always kind of expected it in our older populations, but I did not expect it as much in a college-aged and on-campus population. So still a lot to learn about how we engage people in research, and really start to get those more diverse groups into studies. So a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned still seeing that in students on campus as well, because I guess initially I would think in terms of getting to a biomechanics lab, or access to that, and transportation and all these other factors. But when those things are already covered, but there's still a lack of engagement, I think that's really saying something, and definitely a reason to investigate that more. And I don't know if you can share any of those factors, or give an example of maybe one of the factors, or if it's too early, waiting for the paper to be out, then that's totally
no. I mean, it's really Julia's work, and I will give her all the credit for that. But I think a lot of them had to do still with historical distrust and mistrust of medical research. With Dr. Hill's project, I sort of understood it because we had some blood draws in her study, and because we were looking at some physiologic measures. Julia's study was just with an eMed plate and some surveys, so we weren't really asking them to do much in the way of anything that I would have perceived as being challenging, or would have thought about some of the concerns that have historically been there. Based on the results of some of the surveys, it does seem to stem a lot from being thought of still as guinea pigs, and as not being potentially treated equitably to their white counterparts in studies, and some of the historical things with this Tuskegee studies and things like that. So I think there's just work to be done, because it's going to be really hard for us to address some of the racial health differences that we see when there's still that mistrust and distrust. And I think that has come forward again as we've gone through COVID, and just the differences in seeking treatment and being willing to be part of that conversation. So again, still work to be done on that. And she's moving over to engineering ed, so we'll have to see who wants to take that next step on. But I'm really excited for the work she will do as a future colleague in educating our future engineers in that space. So.
Yeah, I love how you're highlighting sort of where all these different people that you're bringing into this team are coming from, like so many different perspectives, and ones that I don't traditionally think about as being part of biomechanics anthropology, right? Like, but they're so crucial to this work. And so I'm just curious. I also want to say that I appreciate that you said we had arguments. Like, these are not easy. Like, you're acknowledging these are not easy things to talk about. Like, these are things we have to wrestle with, and I think that is hard work, and that is work we all need to be doing. So I'm curious, for those who want to be doing that work and want to start exploring things like this, do you have any advice on who to talk to, how to get started, like just from all of your experience in doing this? I think that could be helpful to hear.
No, it's a great question, and I don't know that I have to I don't think there is one answer.
Right, you don't have a formula.
You don't have a formula, right? There's none of that.
Yeah.
What I would say is it's about starting conversations, and that's been something for me across my career that's been incredibly important. I always walk into a situation realizing that whoever I'm getting ready to talk to is an expert in something that I'm not. And so understanding that it's important for me to sit and listen and learn, and to continue to learn from them has always been really important. So, some of those relationships have existed for decades, and yes, I'm not old, but yes, some have been decades long, and some are new. And I think each time it's about trying to weave a story that makes sense and brings the right group of people into the room. And a lot of times it's happened different ways. I'll be very honest. Sometimes it's me reaching out and saying, I want to start this project. Do you have an expertise in this area, from a website or from whatever? Sometimes it's the students. Dr. Reed came into the space because Charisse took a course from him when she was here. And she's like, I took this really cool course on racial health disparities, which she had told me she was going to take. But I was like, oh, amazing. And I kind of wish I could go sit in the class, but he's now retired, so I cannot. But he's fantastic. So that was how he ended up with us, was she taken a class with him. And then when we started down her project, I said, can you reach out to him? I would love to sit down, the three of us, and just talk this through. I need to have a better understanding of this. I need to, so that I can explain it to my engineering colleagues in a way that they're going to be able to accept that we're not going to do a blood test or something and make a definitive decision on that.
Right.
So I think it's about being open, and it's about being a little bit vulnerable, which I know we as scientists also don't talk about. But I am completely happy to go into a room and say, okay, I don't know this. This is not my space. This is not what I do. I'm really here to learn from you. And we'll have some great conversations. Usually, the project is not solidified day one. It usually takes multiple conversations and multiple meetings to come to it. They ultimately end up being fantastic colleagues that I'll call on for other projects or other things that we have going on. So it's about, for me, it's always been about building a community. And that's what I try and get the students to see while they're here is it's really hard to do any of the work that we're trying to do in isolation. We need them. I mean, beyond the ones I've talked about, I've also had psychologists that are part of our group, and physical therapists and athletic trainers and orthopedic surgeons, and it really depends on the question we're asking. And having the right people at the table makes all the difference in the world, to be able to grapple with the things that aren't easy. So I don't know that was a great suggestion, but just being willing to go out and ask for help and start to have conversations with people, I think is the best way for me that I have found.
Yeah, openness and humility. I think those are
Yeah. And
two key
vulnerability.
things. And vulnerability. Yeah,
Yeah.
like, right. I think starting there is a great start. Great advice. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. And